Okay, good afternoon, everyone here in India, and good morning or good evening if you're in other parts of the world. Welcome to this edition of the Wednesday seminar series. This is being co-hosted by the Institute of Chinese Studies in New Delhi, along with Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, the India office. And today we have a topic which is topical, at the same time unclear and complex to many China watchers. It is about the Chinese economy. We've called it shifting gears of China's post-COVID economy. A few disclaimers here. We are not entirely sure we are in the post-COVID era, but we're using this marker because it also denotes many other things in China. And we have used the metaphor of a car. We're talking about gears because there are several things in motion today in China. There's a shift away from dependence on exports towards boosting internal consumption. There is also a drive towards self-sufficiency, especially in the high technology industry. And on the external side, we have US-China tensions, which have reached a new level of maturity with the new US administration coming in. That has again prompted a number of trends to be triggered. And of course, COVID itself, the response to COVID, the vaccine-related diplomacy and other issues which have impacted China greatly. And as a result, today, I think most industry players or governments are today in the process of rethinking their China strategy, whether you call it offshoring, decoupling, China plus one, there are many names for it, depending on what kind of a stakeholder you are. But there is no doubt that people are constantly reevaluating their relationship with China. So this is the context with which I would like to introduce today's extremely interesting panel. Our first speaker is Dr. Hans Tong from the National Taiwan University. Hans Tong is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and a faculty associate of the Center for Research in Econometric Theory and Applications at National Taiwan University. Apart from many papers that he has authored and co-authored, he's brought out a book in 2019 titled Economic Growth and Endogenous Authoritarian Institutions in Post-Reform China, which is again topical for our discussion today. He has developed multiple strands of research, one of which I will read out, also utilizes advanced neuroscientific methods and data to explore political economic decision making. Our second speaker, Dr. Mareike Olberg, an old friend of the Institute of Chinese Studies, who had visited us for a program on the digital economy in the pre-COVID era, has joined us again. We're very happy to have you here, Mareike. She's a senior fellow in the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund and leads the Stockholm China Forum. She's based in German Marshall Fund's Berlin office. And before joining GMF, Mareike worked at Merix, where she focused on China's media and digital policies, as well as the Chinese Communist Party's influence campaigns in Europe. She was an An postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University's Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies, and she has also spent several years living and working in Greater China. She has a recent book too, which has come out, which is called The Hidden Hand: How the Communist Party of China is Shaping the World. Our third speaker today is Dr. Priyanka Pandit from the Shiv Nadar University in India. She's a China Studies postdoctoral research fellow supported by Ashoka University and Harvard Yenching Institute at the Department of International Relations and Governance Studies. Her research focuses on the politics of China's economic reform, China-India economic relations, theories of international negotiations, and China's engagement with multilateral economic institutions. She holds an MPhil and PhD in Chinese Studies from the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and a master's in East Asian Studies from the University of Delhi. She was also formerly with ICWA, and she has also taught at the Yunnan University of Finance and Economics. Our fourth speaker for today is Ms. Nivedita Rao, who is one of the China-India Visiting Scholars Fellow of 2020-21. Nivedita is a development economist with an interest in globalization, comparative development, and more recently, gender and labor markets. She currently works with the Chief Economist Office at Tata Sons Private Limited with a focus on the intersection between macroeconomics and public policy. Previously, she worked as a research analyst at PRS, Legislative Research in New Delhi, tracking education and health sectors. I would like to make it clear that her views today do not reflect those of our employers. She's speaking today in her capacity as an India-China visiting fellow, where she has undertaken some research. And lastly, I'm Santosh Pai. I'm an honorary fellow and treasurer at ICS. I'll be the moderator. And we request the audience members to stay on mute. And you can either type in your questions in the chat box, or you can use the raise hand button on Zoom. And I'll call upon you at the end of the session during the Q&A session. To kick off things today, I now invite Mr. Peter Rimele from our co-organizer Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. Mr. Rimele is based in Delhi and is very familiar with many facets of the civil society in Delhi and is an active speaker in various forums. So I request you, Mr. Rimele, to kick off today's proceedings by setting the stage within 5 minutes if possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Santosh. So at the beginning, first of all, let me greet all the participants and the esteemed panelists. At the beginning, I would like to point out two facts. It's number one, China's hegemonial claims in its strive to become the world leader. In a way, probably territorial disputes and things have never happened before. China bases it on a past what also hasn't happened. The second one, you just mentioned it, Santosh, is the talk about decoupling. Since more than 1 year, we have several events where this is happening. There is lots of talk about decoupling. I just haven't noticed it happening. In my observation, at best, we come to some greater level of diversification, but not decoupling. In a stark departure from the once ironclad policy of market liberalization, today's China, under the leadership of Xi Jinping, is ever increasingly tightening the party's control over all business located in its territorial reach and maybe beyond. These autocratic forms of power display by the CCP are exemplified inter alia by the government-controlled media outlets continuously spewing out stern warnings to multilateral organizations such as, let's take Nike, that they must refrain from condemning human rights violations in Tibet and Xinjiang if they intend to continue their lucrative business operations in the country. These threats should by no means be mistaken as just a bluff to arm twist companies into submitting to the CCP's worldview, as there are several recent examples. The most prominent, you're all aware, there was a fine of $2.8 billion against the mogul Jack Ma's company Alibaba, officially justified with the corrupt practices within the company. But as is all often the case in China, the unofficial reasons lie rather elsewhere, namely in Jack Ma's dealing with Alibaba's affiliated company, the Ant Group, which have angered the CCP. Interestingly, this ever-tightening chokehold of the CCP on business or businesses is taking place at a time when the Chinese economy appears to be stuck in a major slowdown, as well as to be facing daunting demographic problems marked by sharply declining birth rates, a rapidly aging population, and steadily falling productivity rates. Such a scenario within my home country, Germany, would most likely lead each and every economist to argue for a more liberal and a less government-fettered business sector. Instead, the CCP appears to have opted for the exact opposite, choosing a strategy wherein the business sector takes the backseat vis-à-vis the CCP. To comprehend such an apparently contradictory policy of the Chinese government, one must recognize the drastic changes in China's economy strategy over the last couple of years, which started under the presidency of Xi Jinping. Allow me, ladies and gentlemen, to add some of my maybe analytical remarks in this regard, which will certainly be taken up more comprehensively and in greater depth, or perhaps even contradicted by this panel of extraordinary experts. China has arguably regressed from the days of market liberalization that accompanied its accession to the World Trade Organization in the year 2001. Xi Jinping's new economic strategy can be encapsulated in three words: interventionist, domestic-oriented, and self-reliant. So you see there is also a Chinese version of Atmanirbhar. Self-reliant, or as the CCP calls it, a dual circulation strategy. For instance, under this strategy, one of the goals is to source 70% of key production materials domestically by 2025. Although at first glance it appears that such a strategy is very much self-centered, the Chinese economic system actually aspires to make the whole world dependent on its local supply chains. This ambition was reflected in various speeches by Xi Jinping, in which he openly spoke, for instance, of the need to tighten international production chains, dependence on China. And if we look at the sample some years ago, Japan made the experience with rare minerals. This is just part of this policy, and forming powerful countermeasures and deterrent capabilities based on artificially cutting off supply to foreigners. This aspiration explains the party's recent heavy-handed stance towards companies. In order for this change to be successful, China requires companies to completely bow to the whims of the CCP. This in turn, of course, has far-reaching consequences for foreign companies as well. For instance, data shows that the number of foreign firms investing in China fell by more than 15% over recent years, while at the same period of time, the number of Chinese firms in the land of the Red Dragon increased by more than 10%. Moreover, foreign companies are increasingly pressured to share their technology with local partners. And furthermore, in order to maintain the CCP's narrative of a strong China as an example of development, for other developing countries, the party does not tolerate any company that challenges it by pointing out its gross human rights violations. The CCP's message in this regard is once again clear: either companies abide by the party's rule by not pointing out wrongdoings regarding human rights or other sections of society, or they will be denied access to the still lucrative Chinese market. In relation to Germany, these worrying developments seem to have been grasped rather slowly. A change of strategy with a diversification of supply chains away from the Chinese market is now being discussed, not only in political circles, but also in the boardrooms of the majority of the largest German investors in Germany. Let me conclude, ladies and gentlemen. The gears of the Chinese economy seem to have shifted irrevocably towards a party-centered, authoritarian system in 2013, and there is no end in sight under Xi Jinping's leadership anytime soon. As companies from democratic countries play a central role as practitioners and protectors of a rules-based world order, based on principles such as reciprocity, respect for human rights, democratic values, the lessons of Chinese autocratic economic strategy must be drawn and applied rather quickly. Not only for the reasons mentioned above, but also for monetary ones, as the risk of a single misstep against the CCP can mean the end of an economic activity in the country and thus extensive financial consequences for a company. Diversification of global supply chains away from monopolies like China towards like-minded democratic nations is therefore the need of the hour. However, if these arguments fail to convince you, ladies and gentlemen, let me quote the words of Peter Drucker, the renowned market guru, who once said, "The ultimate resource in economic development is people. It is people not capital or raw materials that develop an economy. Thus, my question to all of you, ladies and gentlemen, is whether we can really continue to justify massively supporting an economy for which people, despite the name People's Republic, are not worth that much more than capital or raw materials, instead of increasing our investments in like-minded democratic countries like India. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Amele, for that very thought-provoking opening remarks. You pointed out many other wheels of the vehicle which we were talking about. So I now turn to our first speaker, Professor Tong. I would like you to maybe highlight how the concentration of power within China has gained momentum during the COVID breakout and how it will continue in the coming years, especially the weakening of institutions which influence the economy, since we are today discussing the Chinese economy. So you may start now. If you would like to share your presentation, I think you can share your screen now.
I'll do that when I need it.
Okay.
Many thanks for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be in such a panel with other excellent experts in the field. And I would like to kind of kick off the sequence of the talks by kind of laying out the institutional foundations of China's for China's economic growth both before and after Xi Jinping. And I actually fully agree with what Peter just said. I mean, there are lots of very insightful observations about what has been done since Xi Jinping became the president in 2012. And so I guess especially against the backdrop of this, internal circulation and the suppression of over digital businesses in the case of the IPO recently, I think it's really worthwhile to look back to the institutional foundations upon which the Chinese economy was able to grow. And of course, we all have to kind of go back to Deng Xiaoping for his kind of legacy. And well, I mean, long time ago, I mean, especially since when we were all the students learning Chinese politics and economy, then we all know that what we used to characterize Chinese regime as a kind of collective leadership. So in other words, you have many political elites who share power with each other, and it really provides kind of very stable political framework back then, and especially from an international and economic perspective, that actually provides a bedrock for international cooperation to happen. And the reason is, I think with this kind of a Chinese style checks and balances, the power of the party, the general party secretary and political leaders at the center, their powers are really checked, by each other. And so that provides a very interesting Chinese version of checks and balances, and allow Western, politicians and business people especially to reasonably predict, what's going to happen in China. But the institutional backdrop actually, of course, changed since Xi Jinping took power. I'm not going to, of course, pass any moral judgments on whether it's good or bad for Xi Jinping to do that. Maybe there are some reasons that why you want to do that, except for the personal ambitions. But I guess the point is, after he became the president, he adopted a new approach. And in his new approach, he personalizes the political coalition in China, and then basically undermines the power sharing framework the politicians in China used to enjoy through the anti-corruption campaigns. And then, of course, also with the advancements and help of the digital technologies and communication technologies, the regime was able to even monitor society in a more tighter fashion. So basically, you have this comprehensive tightening up of the control, either over the political elites and over the entire society. And as Peter just mentioned, all these, from the, as I said, the traditional perspective, I mean, basically the effects of such a personalization of politics in China actually undermines and sabotages the institutional foundations for the previous, international cooperation and economic prosperities, and especially I think the private sectors were able to grow, previously because of this checks and balances, and even the decentralizations of power, especially in economic arena. So it was that decentralization that allows the private sectors in China to grow, and of course that will also allow lots of international cooperations in economic arena to happen. But apparently, after Xi Jinping came to power, I mean, all these parameters have been changed. And then let me share with you some recent research I was fortunately to be a part of during the pandemic. And I think with all these new political parameters that I just mentioned, well, basically the COVID-19, the pandemic really provides the first testing grounds for how this regime works. And of course, I mean, it's hard to use data to convey everything, but it at least provides us something to work on. So let me share out my screen first. So I was fortunate enough to participate in two large international collaborations, and the first one is actually it's a project affiliated with the Viden Institute based in Sweden, and I cooperated with other colleagues there in the institutes, and we have this Pandan project. Basically, the project is for collecting data across the world, and that I just single out China specifically for this particular context. And as you can see here, this is the first index we have. It's called the Pandemic Violations of Democratic Standards, and as you can see here, well, China apparently stands out for lots of major violations. So the Pandan score here is 0.75, and that falls under this major violations. Compared to other countries such as South Korea and Japan, and there of course only have some minor violations or even no violations. So apparently, Xi Jinping's strategies, or the kind of political maneuverings, basically provides this new state capacity to deal with this pandemic and crises in China. But using another index here, this is another index called the pandemic backsliding. So the previous one is about how the measures during the pandemic violates democratic principles, and this one about particularly about pandemic backsliding. It's a measurement about how those measures actually hurt or undermine the democratic procedures in the countries too. But of course, since China is not a democracy, so you can see here the back score is only 0.13. So in other words, it's actually only have low risk. But the reason is just because China is not a democratic country to begin with. So I guess the point I would like to convey here is that the measures themselves apparently violated lots of democratic procedures and rules, even of course from the Western standards. But within China, Xi Jinping's regime was actually able to prepare the stage to cope with this crisis even before the pandemic happened. So in other words, when the pandemic hits, the regime doesn't have to do a lot of damages to its original political framework. And so combined with this piece of evidence, another major international collaboration I was part of was this cross-national survey on people in terms of their the physical contact and their policy supports for the government, and also their personal hygienic habits. And of course, all the three dimensions are highly correlated with how a country can actually handle the crisis and the content, the outbreak. And so the key message I would like to convey here through this piece of data is that, well, let's see. I mean, the dots here, of course, different colors represents different dimensions of the preventative measures. But the most important part is that this is, in this project, we're trying to say national identity can actually predict people's cooperation and compliance with this policy requests from the government. And so you can see here, these different dots, of course, represents different magnitudes of the effects. And China actually is here ranked number 2, just below Denmark, in terms of how national identity of people can actually exert effects on helping the country to deal with the pandemic. So combined, these two factors combined, I would like to say, of course, it seems that China, given its very strong state apparatus and the power to contain the pandemic, it seems that, it's a successful case. But I would like to point out two important components here. The first one is about the institutional foundation Xi Jinping has laid out. And of course, the price to pay, of course, is that it undermines the old Deng Xiaoping's political legacies. And second, also there's a rise of nationalism in China. And it seems that from this project and the data we have, it also shows that nationalism in China is rising, and it seems to also be a little bit helpful to China for contain the pandemic. And so I think this kind of lays out the very a kind of fresh new political economy situation in China that we have to face, especially when we are talking about the economic transitions in China. And I guess I will stop here for now and probably join the discussion afterwards. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Tong. That was extremely interesting. Use of data to explain how China was always prepared to deal with a pandemic. That's quite shocking. If a country has that much control to contain a pandemic even before the pandemic comes. So that was very illuminating. Thank you. To build on that, I'll now request Priyanka to step in and explain to us the genesis of this dual circulation economy. Is this a new phenomenon? Was this in the making? And how does this entire pandemic crisis compare to what we have seen in the past? For example, the financial crisis, in terms of how China responded and what stimulus it gave. So again, from the economic perspective, Priyanka, please.
Thank you, Chair. Before I begin, I would like to thank ICS, Ambassador Kantha, and Mr. Pai for inviting me to the discussion. Also, thank you, ICS research team, Rija, Shruti, Rangoli, for all your assistance. I would like to make 2 points. Talking about the Chinese policy response to COVID, it is important to remember that Chinese economy has already given off some warning signs in 2013, 2015, and just before the pandemic. While there has been some sort of acknowledgement among the Chinese policymakers that China's economy has already entered a new normal phase characterized by growth slowdown, but what they kept worrying till the pandemic hit last year, how much will long-run growth rates decline and how disruptive will the short-run growth be? And a large part of these issues has their origins in 2008-2009 global financial crisis, particularly in China's stimulus package that the government announced to mitigate the economic and the financial effects. Now, the credit-driven stimulus, of course, worked in the short term in terms of getting growth back to the track, boosting domestic demand, but it has proven costlier for the Chinese economy in the long run, and the repercussions of which China is still facing. It has created problems of overcapacity, pushed up debt to GDP ratio, caused overheating in the property market, and so on. So during the initial months of COVID outbreak, the first quarter of 2020, when growth rates plummeted majorly by 6.8%, the worst hit since Cultural Revolution, industrial output fell, urban unemployment sort of peaked. There was a lot of deliberation within Chinese policy circles about stimulus. Stimulus, of course, constituted an important component of China's policy response. And how much of stimulus is to be given and in what forms? And we see that China, of course, the stimulus, if we look at the total pandemic stimulus that China sort of revealed, and at the end of the last year, as part of its total fiscal spending, it was only 6% of its GDP as compared to 19%. And China also refrained from giving direct financial support during the pandemic, and most of the stimulus was in the form of tax easing measures, giving loans to state-owned small and medium-sized enterprises, to some extent to SOEs also, because of its emphasis on state-owned institutions, and repayment deferrals for Chinese businesses, especially the small ones, and of course new infrastructure spending. That was also one of the focus of the stimulus. But then we of course we cannot call it post-COVID period, since China is facing a new wave of Delta virus, and we see Chinese ports shutting down. But if you look at the recovery from the early this year and sort of IMF and World Bank projections, we can say that Chinese economy has been doing better, and therefore there was again debate within Chinese leadership, of course, the highest level leadership. And Professor Tang has given us the institutionalization and the decision making that sort of happens under Xi Jinping. That withdrawing stimulus now remains sort of a trickier, a tightrope walk for the Chinese leadership without snuffing growth or causing broader imbalances, because Chinese regulators and policymakers realize that property prices are rising, which has been a major issue in China. And to tame the property prices, China leadership needs to tighten the credit. But then tightening credit would also create more problems of debt defaults, especially among the state-owned enterprises. So that's something which Chinese leadership has to balance, and that's a concern and a conflict that the Chinese leadership is facing. And the other issue which has been a major source of worry for the Chinese leadership, the middle income trap, the structural problem facing the Chinese economy, something that does not leave any economy for that matter, and the stability of the global supply chains, which is much more of an immediate concern, which we see after the outbreak of the pandemic. Now, it is also important to understand that China has been at the tail end of a long, remarkable expansion, and faces now many structural limitations, and including that of its export-oriented growth model strategy has limits. Then we have the rising wages, when firms sort of Chinese firms face competition from low-cost producers, and then therefore has faced the risk of getting trapped into the middle income level, then moving labor from low productivity to high productivity, manufacturing, and then of course the absence of credible and independent institutions, regulatory institutions. And therefore the shift to this dual circulation strategy, the policy announcement that we had, it has been ongoing for some time, and it actually can be traced back to the 12th five-year plan, the emphasis to domestic cycle of production, distribution, and creation of a domestic supply chain. But the shift sort of gained pace with the US sanctions on Chinese telecommunication companies, with the peaking of US-China trade war, especially when China was not able to get access to these high-tech products, especially the semiconductors. And of course, COVID hastened the process, the current the shift, and we see the policy announcement. And of course, the other thing that sort of also added to the acceleration of the policy announcement was the global supply chains, that how vulnerable they are when faced with a crisis such as COVID, and that they can snag under pressure, and therefore the importance to become resilient wherever it is possible. And China especially, which emerged as one of the crucial economy in the post-global financial crisis in the global production networks, we have seen that it has been facing a lot of heat, and especially due to its, especially because it hid information related to COVID. And there's also been a trend, of course, motivated politically, geopolitically, to move away from China, to move a supply chains, at least part of it, from China. But of course, this is an onerous task. There's been a lot of talks in this direction, and the process has also been ongoing, because the prices in China, the labor prices in China, has also been rising, and therefore the process was there, but COVID sort of, accelerated the process. But then it is not going to happen soon, especially because we have to understand that the global supply chains has its own logic of operations. There's billions of dollars of investments involved, and then the long-standing supply relationships. And therefore, changing the production, geography of production is not easy. From that point, when a multinational supplier networks encompass thousands of independent companies, each with its own specialized contribution. I'll stop here and come back later. Thank you.
Thank you, Priyanka. From politics and policy, we will now turn our eyes to the innovation economy, Before COVID, there was a lot of talk about Made in China 2025 and a whole plethora of policies which promoted science and technology. So I'll request Nivedita now to give us an industry perspective on what's happening within China and how is the world looking at what's happening in China from outside, especially focusing on what Priyanka referred to, the global value chains and the innovation economy in particular. Nivedita? I think Nivedita is muted.
Yeah, I'm on now. Thanks, Santosh.
Okay. Sorry for that.
No worries, no worries. Firstly, thank you so much to ICS and Priyanka for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll just start off my remarks, I think in continuation with what the other panelists have already said, but just add a little bit more detail to it in the sense where I think it's rightly mentioned that the ongoing shifts that we now see, or the shifts which have come to a head in China or are most visible now, have their beginnings in the last 10 to 15 years. We saw policies in the form of, say, the National Medium to Long-Term Program in Scientific and Technological Development, which was meant for 2006 to 20. Then most recently, we saw dual circulation made in China 2025. Now, while all of them are policies on paper, we're starting to see impacts, we're starting to see sectoral shifts. And I'd like to discuss these shifts in 4 major buckets. The first is consumption over investment. We always saw China as a big investment story, but in the last decade or so, we find that investment rates have stagnated at a certain level and haven't grown. Whereas consumption has grown a lot more, considering, the middle class story. Even during the pandemic, we're seeing, there's a survey by the Pew Research Center, the American think tank, where the middle class in China has actually grown, whereas countries like India have lost a major chunk of their middle class, which stands to say that the consumption story holds strong. The second important bucket that we have to discuss while discussing these shifts is services are being taken as the driver of the growth story over manufacturing. And here it's important to also point out that services are also being used to support their traditional manufacturing sector. So it's taking their traditional sectors along, and a lot of times the integration of services is about process and re-engineering when it comes to manufacturing processes. So in fact, the numbers that we see in terms of services contribution to the GDP, which is over 50% at this point since the last few years, may actually be an underestimate, because a lot of the services which get factored into manufacturing processes do not get accounted just as much. The third important thing to mention, or the bucket to consider in terms of shifts, is innovation over imitation, or if I may say, a lot of the sort of low-tech manufacturing that used to happen in China earlier. Just to give you a sense of the numbers, the over 30% of university graduates today in China, and while referring to Peter's remark on, how we have to think about people when we speak about, a country like China, we have 30% plus STEM graduates as of now today in China, which goes to show how seriously innovation is being treated as a peg for development. At the same time, there's an estimate to say that 15 million graduates, university graduates, which is the size of South Korea at this point, will, be a part of the workforce in China in the next 5 years. So it's right here. So the fact that innovation is being given this kind of importance is another important factor to consider. And the last important shift I'd like to highlight, which is tied to this innovation point, is that the export story, like Priyanka mentioned, the export story has its limits. But I think the shift here is that China has shifted to more high-end exports over low-tech manufacturing, in the sense electronics, for instance, was a part of its export bucket at about 8% in 2001 when it just joined the WTO. As of 2018, it's over 30%. So you can see how it's climbed up the ranks in terms of the commodities which are going out of this country. And the second important thing to keep in mind is that it's increasingly producing intermediate goods. It's not relying on other countries to import intermediate inputs as much as it used to. And secondly, what it's producing in terms of intermediate goods is also being supplied to neighboring Asian countries. So for Vietnam or in Indonesia to have flourishing industrial sort of complexes, there is a big part of China's own export story there, which is playing a role. Having marked these changes, I would also like to point out how there may be a lot of talk talk around China plus one, the sort of offshoring, etc. And there are many anecdotal references to it because macro data does not show it yet. But there is a lot of anecdotal references about how industry associations are saying that we may not spend as much in China anymore going forward, etc. But numbers don't really bear this out right now. There are many proprietary indices which look at how countries are still very much exposed to China for trade. In fact, just as of last month, the China-US trade surplus is going strong. It's growing even post the second wave. And the other thing to note is that there is a sense of inertia, or there is a sense of stickiness when it comes to industries moving. These are, of course, large-scale investments, which have a gestation period in terms of being set up and functional. To expect this to happen simply over the last 1 year is, of course, unreal. And none of this is actually happening at the same time anyway, because more and more globalization is about regional value chains. It's about being closer to bigger markets as opposed to being centered in one area alone. So to bypass a big market like China is obviously not something that any conglomerate or any major industrial sort of house can afford to do. So I think with that, I'll round up my comments that the stickiness of China manufacturing will stay, but keeping in mind these other major sort of shifts which are evident in terms of changing the growth levers, and these growth levers have a runway. So the growth story will change. The new normal is going to happen, but it is going to be based off of new levers which have a huge runway ahead of them.
Thank you, Nivedita. Thank you again for using data to explain some of these shifts that are occurring. We'll now move on to the global implications with Dr. Olberg. Mareike, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes.
Great.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
I would like you to ask you, what is the role, now we have seen in the last few months, I think the politics and the economics have mixed in the digital domain. So what's happening there? How has the role of data changed during the pandemic, and what's the future? What do we expect to see from a global sort of implication level, whether it's China and the US tensions or within China in the internet industry? So please take us there.
Thank you so much to the organizers for having me here in this distinguished panel. I feel a little inadequate after the great inputs from everybody else prior to me, but I want to talk a little bit about the trends in digitization and the some of the tug of war over data that we've been seeing. And will, in my next intervention, then go into the role of how this impacts, the listings of tech companies and the US stock market. But there's basically 2 points I want to make. And one is in keeping with what everybody else has already said, that, of course, the pandemic is not something that has introduced something fundamentally different, but it has accelerated existing trends in the area of digitization. So it's sped up some of the developments we've seen previously. And the second thing is that during the pandemic, in part due to the pandemic, in part to a number of other reasons, we've seen, I guess, what I would call the elimination of ambiguity in the relationship between the Chinese state and big tech companies, with basically the Chinese state putting down its foot and saying we're in charge. So first things first, digitization was already very advanced and pursued seriously before the pandemic. I think most people in this room will know this. There are several long-standing reasons for why the Chinese state really, really cares about digitization. One is it urgently needs new drivers of economic growth. When you're no longer the factory of the world, you have to replace it with something. It wants to absolutely reduce its dependency on other countries, in particular United States technology. The strategy of dual circulation has already been mentioned. And the Chinese government does not want to see a repeat of the internet, where it's, somebody else created it, someone else set the rules, and now we have to make do with it. So the idea is, if we're the first movers, then we can shape the rules, which is why we also see quite a bit of a focus on standardization and being the first to innovate something. So this leapfrogging. So it's pretty clear that the Chinese government cares a lot about digitization, but so far it's been unclear how much leeway it would give individual companies in this development, whether it would stick with the idea that, for innovation to happen, you need to give companies a little bit of free rein. And now what we're seeing is a little bit more clarity that this is not how the Chinese state is going to approach this. Again, prior to the pandemic, we already had a very high level of digitization. I always like to give the example of me visiting Shanghai in 2018, where I was literally the only person using cash. Everybody else was paying by app. I think I saw one single person that didn't pay, that paid with cash, just like me. During the pandemic, of course, there's been added urgency. A lot more data is now being collected due to pandemic control. Initially, a lot of this was actually done in the lockdown phase. A lot of this was actually done through good old-fashioned personnel-heavy grid management. But later, after that initial hard lockdown phase, it was replaced with digital controls, digital checkpoints, health codes, et cetera, where people were basically checking in their data wherever they went, generating more huge amounts of data. So some of these apps are collecting massive amounts of data. We're seeing actually a similar pattern as in other areas of digitization, where it's not necessarily one centrally controlled thing yet. You have some involvement of tech companies, and you have a lot of local apps, local initiatives that are gradually beginning to link up. So it follows a trend of digitization that we've also seen elsewhere in surveillance, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the second point that I want to make here is that the key relationship between the Chinese government and big companies has changed in the elimination of ambiguity and asserting government authorities. The tug of war that we're currently seeing between the companies and the Chinese government has also been long in the making, but was kept ambiguous for a while. The basic situation is, of course, the government is highly dependent on tech companies for collecting and processing vast amounts of data. Data, of course, for these companies is a very valuable commodity, which is why companies have in the past resisted giving up access to some of that data and actually tried to assert some of their autonomy. You might remember headlines from 2019 that was held up as a sign of independence of Chinese tech companies, also to stock in international investors, when Alibaba and Tencent refused to share loans data with the Chinese government. And these companies had a certain leverage because they could say, look, we are bringing in money from international investors, we're also accountable to them, et cetera, et cetera. Now, with the new environment brought on by the pandemic and the growing rivalry with the United States, the Chinese government is now saying, okay, that's it. We're having the upper hand, and resisting us is no longer possible. Now, I mean, the most famous cases we've seen, of course, was with Alibaba, and most recently Didi Chuxing. And with Alibaba, just generally, Jack Ma disappeared for 3 months last year after criticizing the government, including regulators and state-owned banks, of course, being competitors of his company. And during that time, in November 2020, the Chinese government actually blocked the IPO of Ant Financial, which is the fintech arm of Alibaba. And later it launched an antitrust investigation into Alibaba. So really cracking down hard on them. And just last month, Didi Chuxing, this ride-hailing app, wanted to list on the New York Stock Exchange, and the company had already previously been under fire from China's antitrust regulators. And within a few days of the listing, which was over July 4th, the Cyberspace Administration started investigating Didi and argued that Chinese user data was not adequately protected and could end up in US hands, and ordered its app stores to remove the Didi app and knocked off 30% of its IPO. A new regulation on how data can be collected and used was issued just this week. Now, there are many reasons for these developments in the relationship between the government and the big tech companies. There is a factor of domestic legitimacy and antitrust. I do think that to some degree, the Chinese government is serious about antitrust, even if it is only for its own control. I do think that it is also looking into antitrust because it can score legitimacy points. Big tech companies have come under fire from the population, from small enterprises that, they're dependent on these companies, et cetera, et cetera. So the government does feel it can show it cares for the little guy with that. It also wants to, I think, discourage US listings. I'll get to that in my next intervention. But a large part of this is about control, who has the upper hand, and the saying of Xi Jinping that, north, east, south, west, the party controls everything. Now, whether this is going to work, this innovation under tight party control, that's up for everybody to decide. But this is the situation that we're facing now. And I think it's become pretty clear that the trend is going to continue in this direction. I'll stop here and look forward to the discussion later.
Thank you, Maika. Now I'll come back to Professor Tong now to help us decipher what these US-China tensions have meant for politics back in Beijing, and how has China fared through the pandemic period with its vaccine experience, whether it's production, distribution, the diplomacy behind it, and so on. So, Professor Tong?
Well, thank you. So let me share this another slide again before I elaborate on the connotations and also implications. So this is again another recent study I conducted with other colleagues, and we did a 14-country cross-national survey, and this is just one part of it. So basically, as you can see here, just very quickly, so we did experiments actually on our subjects, and it's a survey experiment. And as you can see here, either for the developer or the producer, there are two different dimensions. Of course, China, they're both producers and also developers, and also other countries too. And we hypothetically asked our subjects to compare if they have their own countries to develop and produce their vaccines, and how favorable or unfavorable they are towards the vaccines from all these different country variants. And as you can see here, well, the number for China is the lowest, negative. So I mean, here, of course, our main proposition in the paper is that, well, it seems that there is a vaccine nationalism in a sense that people tend to prefer the vaccines developed and produced by their own countries. But among all the foreign vaccines available, it seems that China scores the lowest. And I guess it kind of signifies the significance of the distrust that other countries, people in other countries might have towards China, and also the vaccines. So I think coming back to reflect on the potential implications of the US-China relationship and how China is going to deal with it, I guess I would. So I'll leave the slides here anyway. So I guess my first point is that, as I have mentioned in my first intervention, well, if the bedrock or the foundation for the international cooperation that China used to have, either with the European countries or with the United States, was this, the Chinese style of checks and balances. So in other words, the ability of other political elites to constrain the power of the party secretary and the core leadership basically shows that, well, this is the kind of country that we can cooperate either in foreign trade or in other or in investments. But with the destruction of this kind of framework left by Deng Xiaoping, which seems that most of the foreign elites wouldn't be able to, either economic or political elites won't be able to trust China anymore. So I think just the first point to make is that it seems that the political foundation upon which such international cooperation has disappeared, and especially during the pandemic, as other panelists also have just mentioned, well, it seems that the digitalization, is sped up during this process as everyone is counting on a more digital presence, and the Chinese technologies are also held suspicions over potential intellectual property rights, theft issues, and also potential interventions from China, over the internets of other countries. So, I mean, it seems that other countries don't have access to Chinese politics, of course. And then I used to did a field research in China a long time ago. That's when I did my doctoral dissertation, and that's the time when China, just joined. Basically, that's the time when China was about to hold the Olympics in 2008. And during that period, it seems that I interviewed lots of the people in the foreign embassies, especially American embassies, and basically they show a kind of strong optimism about the way in which they can influence Chinese policymaking and how cooperative Chinese officials were. That was the kind of zeitgeist back then. And now, if you compare the kind of, I got a chance to go back to China to do interviews again with the foreign diplomats, and I guess I would probably get a entirely diametrically opposed viewpoints on the Chinese officials. So now, China, as other panelists also have mentioned, well, they are not ready. They are not like happy to have that kind of cooperation anymore, and they would like to take priorities on many industrial, that they would like to control and also prioritize their own national developments rather than international cooperation. So I think that's a second important point to see. And finally, also as I show here, I mean, this is of course just a sign. I mean, there are other things that we could show to the audience too, of course. Well, there's this comprehensive negative images about China, and I didn't mention the origin of the virus. That's a very controversial topic nowadays. Previously it was viewed as like conspiracy theory, like the virus could be just leaked from a lab in Wuhan, but now, I mean, gradually people start questioning, if not entirely convinced about this leakage theory, but at least people has become more suspicious. And I guess that's a very serious issue that China would have to face now. And along with that conspiracy theory about the virus origin, and this data on vaccine acceptance also help us kind of have a view on how China's image is received now in the world. And finally, I guess another point I would like to make to wrap up this intervention for this round is that before Biden got elected, I kind of share with some other people about this view that maybe the relationship would become a little better after Biden became the president. And because of the Democrats, they, as opposed to Republicans and the Trump supporters, they have different ideas about how they should handle the relationship with China. But after Biden has become the president now, and after several rounds of interactions between the two sides, it seems that it's pretty obvious that there are lots of deep-seated and long-held issues between the two countries. And I think, as many other panelists have also mentioned, well, Xi Jinping and also the political leaders surrounding him seems to have a very strong sense of insecurity, in a sense that, on the one hand, I mean, they would like to consolidate the power, and especially, as we know, the political clock in China is ticking now, right? Next year is going to be the 20th, the Party Congress, and then the year after next year would be the two meetings, right, for determining the government composition. And so, in other words, this political clock is ticking, and as we all know, previously, as I just mentioned, after Deng Xiaoping, I mean, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, they only had two terms in total 10 years for their tenure. And then, it's not, I guess it's not a rumor anymore right now, that everyone knows that Xi Jinping is pursuing a third term. And then, but of course, there are lots of speculations about whether he's going to continue to be the party secretary, or they will kind of reinstate the chairmanship, and that he will become the chairman of the CCP. So there are lots of speculations about that. But I guess one thing that we are sure is that he's going to hold on to power, beyond 2022. And then, apparently, being obsessive with power is not just about his personal nature, but also because the game of this of Chinese politics. And then, so there's no way for China to give in lots of very thorny issues between the two countries. And the U.S. again, facing the pressure in this rising hostility towards China, then it's also hard for the United States and other I guess European countries to have a softer tone towards China. And then, well, it seems that I'm not painting a very rosy picture here, but it seems that all these factors combined and considered, it seems that we're going to have a pretty rocky road ahead, and for the global cooperation, even though we are so much that is so much needed at a point during the pandemic. And thank you. I'll stop here for now.
Thank you, Professor Tong. So if the world is not trusting China, and China's stimulus to recover its economy is much lower than before, then one wonders what is still the dependency on China for the world economy, and how is the world going to be impacted? So Priyanka, could you help us decipher this issue about what China's recovery, in whatever shape it takes, means for the global economy and what maybe some of the early data is showing?
Okay.
And I request all the remaining three speakers to keep their comments to 4 minutes each, because we are now at the top of the hour. It's 4 o'clock now. Yes, Priyanka.
Okay, thank you, Santosh. Yes, an important, if you look at the global economic recovery currently, so an important feature of it is the diverging prospect for some parts of the world, and which is now being referred to as great divergence. We have countries like China and US recovering from the pandemic soon, and whereas the prospects in other countries look much more worse. According to World Bank projections, we know that China's growth is expected to reach somewhat like 8.5% this year, but is expected to slow down. But of course, this projection was before the second wave of virus hit China. Now, the recent projections, of course, are something between 8.2 and 8.3, but which is, of course, not a very low figure. But the question, of course, remains. There are two questions, of course. Santosh asked the question about whether China can step up this time the way China stepped up during 2008-2009 financial crisis in helping the global economy recover, whether countries can still depend on China. I would say that, of course, in terms of trade, yes. We already see that China is part of the RCEP, the 15 Asia-Pacific countries. It is trying to create more trade opportunities to help foster the recovery, of course, at the trade level. And China is also likely to retain a large share in the global production, which Nivedita rightly alluded to, owing to, of course, Chinese firms' easy and quick adoption to technological solutions when COVID hit at an early stage. And of course, it's already a shift towards the automated manufacturing, adoption of AI technologies in manufacturing under the Made in China 2025 policy, a deployment of robots in manufacturing production even before the coronavirus outbreak. But then we also have to remember that given the nature of the crisis that the world is facing, global economic recovery will be contingent on, and the return to normalcy in any kind of economic normalcy will much depend on the rapid vaccination, will depend on an inclusive strategy which ensures production, distribution of vaccines, medicines, techniques, diagnostics to countries around the world, especially to countries with weaker health system. But then the question again remains then, whether China's post-COVID or the rebound that China enjoys now is sustainable. Of course, the answer can't be yes or no, given the qualifications that these generalizations would require, but definitely Chinese economy is facing headwinds for some time now. Despite the optimism that, of course, that is running strong about China's post-COVID recovery, overcoming these red flags, these headwinds is going to be difficult, especially looking at China, especially if you look at China's current policy orientation. And to my mind, the first of these challenges is debt, which is domestically owned and owed. Now, China's debt, 3 times that of its GDP and rising, increased stream of misallocated capitals, rising number of debt defaulters among SOEs. It is clear that the Chinese government is facing huge financial stress, and the upshot of which is significantly lower growth and rising inequality. And therefore, it will be a difficult trade for regulators and policymakers to balance lower growth, rising defaults, weakening funding structures, and of course, the sensibilities of financial system. The second, of course, is the demographic challenge that is also being talked about, especially with the announcement of China's third child policy. China's declining fertility and the rising number of elderlies outside the workforce. We all know that China derived its comparative advantages for a long time from the vast pool of a cheap, semi-skilled workforce. But now it is on the decline as China is witnessing a rapid number of retirees. Now, these retirees, aging problem is definitely going to act as a rigidity and will affect China's movement towards the upper value, movements upwards in the global value chains, which of course requires a supply of skilled labor. And also the problem of social safety nets. Yes, of course, China did provide stimulus, various tax easing measures, but then in absence of social safety nets, and already, and the ones that are existing are very weak and fledgling, it is going to be difficult, again, in the light of the recent third child policy, for the Chinese families to adopt two more members, because that again means a pressure on the young, especially, and not on the elderly. And therefore, families will have a tendency to save more and consume less, which will affect China's transition to domestic consumer-driven economic model. Third, quickly, China's institutions. We all know that authoritarian regimes, of course, face lesser constraints in terms of setting targets, getting things done. But what this sort of lack and fail to provide is competition, incentives, which are again very crucial for guiding innovation and productivity. And then the agier emphasis on state-owned institutions that we see, the party discipline, especially seen in case of Jack Ma, Alibaba, proves the curious conditions that the private enterprises and entrepreneurship in China seems to be currently in. I would like to therefore end by saying that control and conformity that my previous speakers have also referred to and discussed in detail something that Xi Jinping wants to make the hallmark of his rule, and has worked also for the first 5 years, where we see his fluctuating commitment to economic reform and marked by abundant contradictory elements. But they will not be conducive for undertaking or for sustaining innovation related activities. And therefore, Xi Jinping, through his top-down, highly personalized approach to policy making, yes, he has reinforced an institutional culture of artificially conjuring up consensus and conformity, but they stifle competition and increases the risk of misallocation of capital in science, technology, and technological change. Thank you.
Thank you, Priyanka. Yes, indeed. I think the three-child policy has emerged as a major sort of upsetting the apple cart in many ways. Recently, someone told me that theoretically now, a Chinese person in his 20s or 30s can expect to have 9 grandchildren. And that is, a picture which has stayed with me. And it has a lot of economic repercussions. Thank you for that. Now I'll move on to Nivedita to try and help us understand what are China's new priorities at the industry level in terms of technology. In your previous intervention, you spoke about the previous sort of incentives and policies on promoting technology and the innovation economy. And how does it look in the future? What are some of the industries in which China wants to stay on top, or maybe in some cases deprioritize? So how does it look from an industry perspective? Nivedita, 4 minutes, please.
Sure, Santosh, thank you. So I think I'll make one essential point on this in terms of one thread that is going to mark China's performance, whether it's related to supply chains or overall trade relations, is to do with setting standards. And I'd like to spend some time on this, because this touches across various industries, which will be built as a part of what we call the fourth industrial revolution, in the sense so many technologies kind of dovetail into this space. So whether it is setting the standard with in relation to coding with 5G and Huawei being the patent holder here, or whether it's related to emission standards related to EVs. Now, these are all big first steps that China has made. So in that sense, it seems poised to kind of set the rules in a lot of ways in terms of how this potential trade exchange will happen. And of course, there's a lot of economic sense here, in the sense when you get a patent of this sort, other companies will have to pay money to Chinese companies or industrial associations in order to use those standards and build their own technologies on them. So there's a lot of economic gain at stake. But at the same time, also like to highlight how there's a lot of national pride and honor attached to these kind of change of standards and where they come from, because this essentially means that China is now in a position to set standards as opposed to receiving them, or as opposed to being, compelled to follow certain standards which are dictated to it from other companies. So, if I were to speak a little bit loosely on this, it's like changing the axis of knowledge transfers from the north to the south, but from the south to the north now. And that's a huge issue of not just economics, but also national pride at this point in China. And whether it's semiconductors, EVs, 5G, etc., we see big moves in terms of not just investments, but also now increasingly accepted patents in these spaces. And because of these first mover advantages in a lot of these industries, it would be interesting to see the benefits which accrue to China going forward, and how that has geopolitical consequences in terms of how other countries adapt to them.
Thank you, Nivedita. That's a scary picture. I still remember when Xiaomi entered India, I think the Nokia and Ericsson were suing them for use of patents. So what you're effectively suggesting is in the future, we might have a reverse situation where a company from other part of the world starts operating in Asia or in China, and a Chinese company which has hoarded up patents in all these new industries might be able to present a lawsuit saying you're actually infringing on our patents and our standards that we set. That's an interesting thought. So now we'll move to our last intervention from Dr. Olberg. Could you please unpack for us the economic implications of this recent developments with Didi and this move against overseas listings, essentially of raising capital by Chinese companies overseas, especially the United States, because US and China happen to be the top two venture capital markets. And if these two markets are decoupling, what are its global implications? Maraike, 4 minutes. Thank you.
Right. I think I just want to, for the 4 minutes, I just want to explain why this is not a move that's only coming from the Chinese side. I mean, I've talked about how the Chinese government strongly discouraged the Didi Chuxing listing by basically regulating it at that particular moment, but this is not a one-way street. Kind of the end of the love affair between China and Wall Street, as some have called it, is a two-way street, where there's also action on the US side. And this needs some background explanation because US listings of Chinese companies, especially tech companies, have been a fairly risky and uncertain affair for a long time, but now this is really coming to a clashing point. So the first problem is the VIE problem, that actually tech companies, like other companies in restricted areas, are officially not allowed to get investment from foreigners. So what they do is they act internationally as a variable interest entity, as a VIE, a construct to get around that Chinese law prohibiting foreign investment, where you basically you duplicate the company overseas, usually in a tax haven, Cayman Island, British Virgin Island, take your pick. Then the investors actually own shares in this duplicate company, which is then governed through a series of contracts, its relationship with the Chinese companies. These VIEs were in a legal large area in China for the longest time, and still are, I would say, quite risky, even though they're now being regulated, subject to antitrust regulation. Some people think it's a manageable risk for international investors, but a lot of people also think that you don't actually own any shares in this company, and it relies on how Chinese courts are going to enforce these contracts. So it's a risky affair. And the second affair, the second issue from the US side, is the larger auditing issues that applies to all Chinese companies, essentially, where the US is also now taking measures to possibly force the listing of Chinese companies. This has been an issue that for at least a decade didn't come out of nowhere, but it kind of came to the fore last year, where we had one big scandal with Luckin Coffee, kind of the Chinese Starbucks, if you want, where it became apparent that they had basically cooked. The data was not that they provided was problematic, and there was actually nothing behind it. And the problem is that the United States can't audit Chinese companies that are listing in the United States, because those companies say that Chinese law prohibits us from handing over that data, which from everything that we've seen on the Chinese side, yeah, that's kind of true, and they get punished on the Chinese side. And so last year, the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act was signed into law, which basically requires Chinese companies to hand over, if they don't hand over auditing data in 3 consecutive years, they're going to be delisted. Now this year, this timetable was actually sped up to 2 years, that if you don't hand over auditing data for 2 years, you're going to be delisted. Lots of chaos right now. It's not entirely clear how this is going to be enforced. In the end, it probably did play a role in the Chinese government discouraging Didi from listing, because if there were mass delistments on the US side, that would cause quite a bit of chaos on the Chinese side as well. Basically, the US and China might still come to terms in terms of, what data is actually going to be handed over to avoid delisting, but there is a very real chance right now, I would say, that these delistings might actually go ahead, and because both the US and China are sort of moving in that direction. On the one hand, I guess that's good, because the risk of having unauditable black box companies on the New York Stock Exchange is not great, but when it does happen, there will be no good precedent for this, and some people might end up holding the short end of the stick. So this is going to be something to watch over the next 2 years, how this is actually going to play out.
Thank you, Marike. Indeed, I think the VIE structure has overnight become very popular. Everyone seems to know about it. Earlier, it used to be a very niche structure which lawyers were familiar with. But yes, you're very optimistic. You're hoping US and China will come to an understanding about how data can be shared. Let's wait and see. We'll speak about this in a couple of years. Thank you for that. I will not even try to attempt to draw some kind of conclusion. This panel discussion was designed to present a number of sort of perspectives on a variety of issues and precisely to enable the audience to draw a conclusion. So thank you all the speakers for your interventions. We now have about 14 minutes for question and answers. As I look down at the chat box, I think one of the questions has been answered by Peter Remele. Thank you for that. There's a question from on RCEP without India was signed last year in the middle of the pandemic. Is it serving China's purpose? I think Priyanka, would you like to take a shot at this? What has happened in RCEP, both from maybe China's perspective, and how does it play out for India's decision of staying out of RCEP?
Right. Yes, thank you for that question. Yes, with India out, of course, the RCEP, which is substantially market size, reduces in scope. And RCEP might no longer be the world's largest FTA without India. But then, of course, this clears the way for China to set rules in the region, although it is not going to be easy, given its relationship with Southeast Asian countries, especially in the light of the pandemic. But the other thing that it is helping China in a way to shift to plurilateral mode of negotiations, which is again bypassing the multilateral organization, which is WTO. And India has been a key advocate of continuing with the consensus mode and multilateral, inclusive plurilateral negotiations. And of course, RCEP can therefore be offsetting that kind of trend that happens in the that is the basis of the WTO. And of course, with RCEP being operational last year, we have seen that it also helps remove a lot of potential restrictions on sourcing products from China by putting the country in the same category as other members of the trade agreement. So yes, had India been part of the RCEP, India at least would have been in a position to sort of influence the rules in the region. And of course, RCEP also helps China in a way of strengthening its regional supply chain, which is again its extended objective of the dual circulation strategy. So from that point, but of course it is not going to be easy because we see other type of FTAs coming up. Now economic alliances are motivated by geopolitical considerations. We have the Quad on the other hand. We are talking about a free trade agreement among the Quad powers in the Indo-Pacific. There's also possibility of India joining the Comprehensive Trade Partnership Agreement with USA into it. And that might be a challenge to RCEP, and India can, of course, reap the gains of the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Priyanka. Mr. Peter Ramele has, I think, raised his hand. Do you have a question or you want to react to something?
No, I would like to react to what Priyanka just has said and also what Nivedita has said. I want to reiterate that China will set the standards. And one country who likely is most affected of that will be India. If you're going to look east or work east, you likely will do it under Chinese set standards. That also has to do with the Chinese influence in the Belt and Road Initiative countries. It is active and it will somehow set and unite those standards. And those, of course, who are not active or not that active in there will have to follow the set rules. So that is how bleak, as you mentioned before, the future might look like specifically for India. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ramele. Yes, indeed, that's a bleak picture. We have the print, which is the digital news platform, as our partner. So if anyone from the print wants to ask a question, please raise your hand. In the meantime, I'll take a question from Mr. Nirmal Panda on our YouTube channel. The question is, the BRI would surely affect the economies of the region. I'm guessing it's the Asian region. Would you think India's economy will be impacted as India has not joined the BRI? Nivedita, would you like to comment on how BRI is looked at in the Asian region, maybe from the industry perspective, because I think the government views are more or less well known, but maybe an industry perspective will be useful?
Sure. So I think a lot of the rationale that Priyanka mentioned in terms of India's exclusion to RCEP and the repercussions there, I think apply equally here, because there are other avenues which India is engaging on, which have their own sort of, spillovers that we're yet to see. But at the same time, I think specifically in the case of BRI, it does feel like China is aiming for alternative trade channels here, in the sense these are alternative trade spheres, because like Peter also just re-emphasized, standards and contracts in hundreds of contracts have already been signed with these economies, which dictate certain standards. So we have to understand that going forward, any sort of construction or industrial related work that's going to happen in these countries is going to happen based on those standards, and they've already been codified. So I think what we're looking towards is that if you want to approach these economies as India, there may be a lot of technical problem solving involved in terms of entering into contracts going forward. I think that's how I would kind of do some sort of crystal ball gazing when it comes to exclusion from these sort of contracts at this point as they are being signed.
Thank you. Professor Thang, would you like to weigh in on what BRI, what are the implications for BRI from a political perspective, maybe in the post-COVID era? Is it BRI as a project on a weaker footing now, post-COVID? Or is there a clear divergence within the BRI countries? Are some countries going to maybe benefit more, or is China going to benefit more in some countries, but not all the countries? So is there a sort of analysis that can be drawn on how BRI is playing out in the post-COVID phase?
I think my take on this 2 cents on this issue would be, it kind of really depends on, the business people and governments in the region, and how they think about this, political dynamics between the U.S. and China. And I mean, but here in Taiwan, for instance, I mean, we are also quite divided in the sense that, well, some business people really want to join the BRI, and of course, take some advantages. Maybe China, gives to the Taiwanese people, but on the other hand, the government people, they are more suspicious of the intention behind this. And I guess that's kind of reflect the dynamics here, that especially well, Taiwan is kind of sitting in its location between, pretty much in the front, in a struggle between the United States and China. And well, some people apparently see China as a growing, and not just growing, of course, existing superpower in both political and economic sense, and they want to join China to get more prosperity and economic opportunities. But on the other hand, there are also other people who think it's better to join the U.S. So I guess I would imagine that, I mean, several years ago or several decades ago, you imagine that people would try to do some hedging and then, try to get benefits from both sides. But now it seems that, I don't know, the general atmosphere in in India and other parts of the world, but at least here in Taiwan, I think people are kind of struggling with this too. And different people really take different calculations of their risks. And so I think, of course, politics will play a big role here, and the countries or governments that are, less suspicious about the Chinese intention and their influence will probably be more willing to join the BRI and and take some benefits from it. But for those who are think otherwise, they'll probably make a different choice. So it's hard to say. I'm kind of jury's still out at this point, especially during the pandemic. And as I said, if I want to drew upon some of the points I made previously, I would say, of course, it doesn't seem to be it doesn't seem to be very optimistic in the sense that if people got more suspicious about the origin of virus, and if China doesn't respond to this kind of suspicion forcefully and effectively, then I think that would be a negative. They would have some negative impact on how people perceive BRI and its prospects. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tong. I'll now maybe, as a last question, ask Maraike for a European perspective on not just BRI. We have seen Europe discuss a treaty with China in the post-COVID era. I think a lot of our listeners will be curious as to how is that playing out? Is it ready for implementation? Is it just something that was done to keep engagement going on? Does BRI play into that? So Maraike, your views, please.
Yeah, you're alluding to the debacle that was the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment. Again, we don't know what's going to happen, but for now it's on ice and it doesn't look like it's going to move forward. This was kind of fraught with problems to begin with. It was, that agreement was negotiated for 7 or 8 years. People had considered it dead because there was no progress from the Chinese side for the longest time. And then, of course, as most of you will probably know, at the end of last year, it was signed, surprising basically everybody except the small negotiation team that have been working on this. A lot of this was driven by Germany and France, which was, some other countries in the EU were not too happy about that, which is why they leaked some nice little details about it, how, that was a bit problematic. It was, of course, also problematic from a US perspective because it was, and I think that was intentional, to come ahead of the Biden inauguration to make sure that you have that signed. Now, from the European perspective, the people arguing for it said, well, look, the US got its phase 1 trade deal. Why can't we have our thing here? The problem is, and they argued this is basically the best conditions we're gonna get for this investment agreement. But then it was already viewed very critically. There was already shaping up to be some opposition from the European Parliament, which has to go through the European Parliament. And then, of course, everything basically collapsed with the sanctioning issues in March of this year, where the EU for the first time issued very mild, actually very, very mild sanctions on a couple of people, and then one entity in Xinjiang over human rights violations in Xinjiang, and China sanctioned back big time. And that was basically when that agreement collapsed. And it's not 100% sure that it is dead, but it's definitely nobody wants to touch it right now. And they're basically, the people who still want it are probably hoping that if we don't touch it for now, maybe we can bring it back later, but it's very much up in the air. And for right now, it doesn't look like it is going to move forward.
Thank you, Marike. Thank you. I think that's a candid analysis, much appreciated. Now, you have chanced upon a topic of sanctions. Maybe we need a new discussion for that on counter sanctions and sanctions between China and other countries on a whole lot of this thing. So I won't start any new topic, but we do have an audience question from, is that Varun? Yes, Varun Sharma is asking, foreign firms have long complained that enforcing their IP rights in China is difficult. Which China has unethically used. Any views on this? I guess what he's saying is, in the future, how will this be looked at, along with all the mistrust that China has accumulated in the last few months or 1 year or so? How is IP protection playing out in the future? So I would invite anyone to take this. Priyanka, Nivedita, you want to comment on this?
Yes, quickly. On the IP rights, of course, when China joined WTO, this was an issue. This has been an issue till date because transparency is a problem in Chinese firms, the way Chinese firms operate. And also you have to understand that Chinese IP laws are again not in sync with the global IP laws. It has its own laws. But again, from a foreign firm's perspective, most of the foreign firms, leaving the big ones aside, including some subsidiaries of the big firms operating in China, and my experience while interviewing them, that most of them had said that they sort of overlook those laws and continue to operate within the Chinese framework, at least 2-3 years ago, and of course driven by the economic gains. So we see that kind of a compromise being reached by the foreign firms and the Chinese firms, where the foreign firms sort of giving to the Chinese IPs laws that they sort of that the Chinese government sort of imposed while in their interactions. Yes.
Thank you, Priyanka. We have now gone past 4:30. I would like to conclude today's panel discussion by thanking all our panelists today, and special thanks to both our partners, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and the print media channel. We hope to have all of these speakers back again on maybe different topics or a similar topic after a few months to take stock again. Thank you to all the audience members who stayed and joined us today for this Wednesday seminar. Do follow ICS activities on our website and social media channels.